you have to think about what are the hard questions that you're going to be asked, both internally and externally.
Hello, welcome everybody to another episode of How Many CTOs Does It Take podcast. I'm Brad Heftigaub, and my co-host is Scott Porad.
Hello.
And today we have a guest with us, Marcello Calbucci, who's a longtime CTO, startup founder. Marcello and I met years ago in the sales startup scene, and he's got a new book out called the PRFAQ. Welcome to How Many CTOs Does It Take podcast, Marcello.
Hey, folks. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on here. We appreciate it.
Why don't you give us a little rundown, Marcello? What have you been up to lately?
Yeah, so I just published a book a couple weeks ago. It's called the PRFAQ Framework, Adapting Amazon's Innovation Framework to Work for You. That came from the couple years that I spent working at Amazon, and prior to that, many years at startups, and wondering like, how come these two things haven't, got together and had a baby yet? So I created that baby right now, which is the book. So primarily, I'm focusing on, evangelizing and talking about this framework with folks, so they understand what is it for, what's not for, how to use it, what's the value, how to adapt to startups and product managers everywhere. And very quickly about me, before that, I spent a couple years at Amazon. Before that, 18 years of startups in Seattle and London. Before that, many years at Microsoft, working at Bing. Before that, hacking, on my basement kind of thing.
Love it.
I have a question for you just to get out of the gate here, Marcello.
Go ahead, Scott.
After all those years of doing early stage startups, what did it feel like jumping into the ice bath of Amazon? Was it a shock to your system, or did it feel like actually a warm shower?
Yeah, it was a shock. I'm not going to lie. Like among the big companies, Amazon is very interesting, very entrepreneurial. But just if you compare to like your Microsoft, your Google, your Meta of the world, it still is a big company. So everything is, somewhat bureaucratic and a little bit slow. Decisions need to be looked at from all different angles, from legal and compliance and engineering and like everything that you can imagine, right? So sometimes you want to move fast and do certain things. And I'm not going to say that Amazon doesn't move fast. It moves fast for a big company. Still is 10 times lower than a startup.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I imagine.
And had you worked with the PRFAQ? Is that a tool that you would use in your toolkit before Amazon, or did you learn about it there?
I learned before I joined Amazon, but like you don't know what it is until you practice it and use in real life. It's almost like, oh, I know about LLMs, but I never coded against an LLM API. So like, yeah, but you don't know, right? So that's how it was for the PRFAQ for me.
Did you just kind of fall in love with it when you were there, or like it's clearly captured your imagination in some way because you wrote a book about it? So like, what's that story?
Yeah. So what happens is like Amazon uses the PRFAQ extensively, right? So every decision the company makes usually starts with a PRFAQ. I shouldn't even say usually, always starts with a PRFAQ, right? Any meaningful decision, sometimes a decision that's going to cost only $100,000, there is a PRFAQ behind it, right? And these decisions are about new business or a new product or a new feature, or even a new program or a new policy within the company. So IT might decide to change some policy about, laptops. It's going to write, someone at IT is going to write a PRFAQ, and that PRFAQ is going to be used to discover and debate the right strategy to do this. Like, why are we doing? Like, what is the impact? How are customers going to think about it? And in the case of IT, the customers are the employees, right? So they incorporate that thinking. And very quickly, as like a participator in many of these PRFAQ reviews early on, not my own PRFAQs, but someone else's in my organization, I realized, wow, this is really powerful. It's a very interesting tool. It's kind of odd in the beginning because the format is very strict. The style of how you review it and how you look at it is very strict. Not strict, is prescriptive. Would be the right word, right? So if you're like, oh, this is strange, but as soon as you get into the rhythm of it, it's really hard not to see this as a major asset for thinking strategically and making decisions.
One of the things that I think I really resonated with me in the book was this notion of making sure that you've really captured the why behind the thing that you're trying to make the decision around, whether that be building a product or to your point about like some new laptop provisioning policy or something like that. And there was like one of the lines that was out of your book that I really resonated with me was this idea. And I think it was how many software engineers or designers wake up on Monday morning and pick up the next item in the backlog and start working on it without understanding the customer value behind it. And when I read that line, I was like, yes, like that is so often, I think, the challenge that engineers struggle with. Like if they understand the customer value, then they're going to do their job so much better than if they don't. So I'm just kind of curious. Maybe that's just my little bias, and so my confirmation bias was like, yes, that resonates with me. But do you feel like is that kind of one of the key things that we should be taking out of the PRFAQ toolkit, or what? How would you say like the most salient thing that engineering teams should take out of this toolkit would be?
Yeah, and I said designers and engineers, Brad, but it's also, managers and directors and VPs that sometimes are just working on things without actually questioning, what are we doing here? Like, why are we doing this? Like, what is the value that we're creating for our customers and for our organization? So the biggest value of the PRFAQ is a team, and I'm using the word team very broadly here, not only the team working on it, but the team adjacent to the project as well, that are aligned on strategy and vision. Like everyone discussed, debated, discovered, and decided on that vision. It's not a committee driven decision. Still, you have a few people that were responsible for the decision making, but everyone was involved in the process of coming up with that, and they had an opportunity to question certain aspects of the project, like, oh, I don't think the technology is possible, or a product person say like, I don't think we can build this, or a UX person say like, well, the design shouldn't be like that, or the legal team say like, oh, no, you can't collect that kind of information. So everyone had a little bit of their voice incorporated into a single document that integrates all this thinking, in a cohesive way, so that anyone reading it will be like, oh, I understand what's going on, even if I don't agree with it. Like it makes sense from A to Z. Like it's there. So, that's where Amazon has the leadership principle of disagree and commit. Like once you understand what is in there, you might even disagree, but like the team is aligned that that's the direction we're going to go, and that's the direction that we're going to go.
Well, I was just going to try to take a step back here. And could you just give us a quick and I know I'm like you were talking about with the guy who's never programmed against the LLM. Like I know this concept. I've used it informally throughout the years, but I've never worked at Amazon, so I really don't know the real deal. I'm wondering if you could just outline for us just for a second, like tell us the real deal, what it's like to really, how it really works.
Yeah, let me take a step back here. And let me say PRFAQ stands for press release and frequently asked questions. So this was invented by Amazon circa 2003, 2004 as a decision-making mechanism. And it's often referred as the working backwards six-pager. Amazon has other types of six-pagers. The PRFAQ is one of them, right? And what it is a press release that paints a picture of the future, right? So what you're really talking about is, what if we launch this product today? How would we announce it? Right? So you write that press release and in the first page, and then you have 5 pages of frequently asked questions. And the questions can be, from a customer perspective, like, oh, how much this is going to cost? How do I get started? Can I import my data? So you're answering those questions as if customers were asking them. And then you have another section that is called the internal FAQs, that is for the team asking itself certain questions like, who is the customer and what problem are we solving for them? When do you think we can have this data set to integrate into the product? Or like, how much this is going to cost to operate? Like that type of questions that are answered on the FAQ. Now, the document is just an artifact that is used as a catalyst for conversation. Like, so the goal is not to create like the perfect document alone in a room. The goal is to collaborate with all your team members to create this document so that when it's done, everyone agrees on it, right? There is no big reveal of like, ta-da, here is the strategy. Like, go execute on it. That's not really how it works, right? Like, people work together on it, which is very different than some organizations that use like PRD or functional specs, and like they just throw over the wall to the engineering team, go build it, right? PRFAQs are not like that. The intention is not like that. And by the way, PRDs should not be like that either. Like, you want the engineers in the process of creating that PRD. But most companies don't have that practice. But PRFAQ doesn't work if you don't do it like that, right? The point is like collaborative discovery.
It's almost like it's the recording of the conversations and the outcome of those, not the input or direction for everybody, but the kind of, as people talk and develop a shared understanding of whatever this thing is going to be, this kind of memorializes that. Is that kind of a good way to think about it?
That's exactly right. You know, it's not uncommon to have things in the PRFAQ to say like, what are we not doing? You know, or like, why have we decided by option A versus option B? Like, it's on the PRFAQ, right? Because that conversation took place, and halfway through, the team decided to do it differently. So you keep it there, right? It's part of one of the FAQs.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting, Marcelo. I kind of was thinking about how one of the things that I remember from the early days, for example, of Real Networks, we were really adamant about creating what we would call rude Q&As about, once we did a product release, like, or as we prepared for a product release. And of course, the spirit behind the rude Q&A is, there's no questions, no questions are barred, right? Like, what is the most antagonistic question that the press could ask, the competitor could ask, and we might ask ourselves about this product. And I think that, I guess I'm sort of like digesting you talking about the way to create these PR FAQs, it does strike me that so often team members are, well, why are we doing it that way? Or why didn't we do it that way? Or what about this corner that we're not turning to look down? Like, why aren't we considering this? And it does strike me that there's this value in the rude Q&A, the value in the questions that are the hard questions. And I'm assuming that that's an important part about the FAQ, is that you really are capturing the tough legal question from the privacy team, right? You're capturing it and you're answering it as part of your getting on the same page.
Yeah, that's right, Brad. You got it correctly. I talk about rude Q&A in the book, right? You have to think about what are the hard questions that you're going to be asked, both internally and externally, right? Like, how are the customers going to feel about certain things? How does this compare with that other product? Or like, why would I share this data with you? So you have to think about that and incorporate that into the document, right? To create good conversations. The one thing that is important to say, Brad, as well, is a PRFAQ is not a plan, it's a strategy. Right. So you keep it very high level. Usually don't go to which cloud provider are we going to use? Which LLM vendor is the best one for us? Sometimes you might incorporate some of that because there is a uniqueness to that tactic of the plan that has an impact on the strategy. But most of the time, you don't want to go to that level of detail, right? A PRFAQ is basically the starting of a project. It's like the kickoff. Let's spend, actually pre-starting of a project. Let's spend, 2 weeks on this PRFAQ to make sure that we understand the vision, we understand the strategy, we understand certain outcomes that we're trying to achieve, and everyone is aligned on that. Once you arrive to a certain alignment, then you go like, all right, we are a goal for this project. Let's start working a plan now.
Okay, so you've given me, I want to explore an idea here with you, Marcelo.
Go ahead.
Something Brad and I have talked about a bunch is tech debt. And I was just talking to one of the engineers on my team this week about kind of an area he wants to address, where there's some problems, where there's a lot of tech debt. And I'm trying to think, I was just thinking, as you're talking, I was thinking about how could he use this? Like, who would his audience be when he was writing that press release? I can imagine what the FAQs would be like, but I'm trying to think about who the audience would be. You ever seen it used like that? For an engineer sort of talk about it?
Yes, absolutely. Not only I've seen use cases like that on the book, I include a example just like that.
Oh,
About engineering team replacing, a piece of outdated technology. So the audience for that is everyone who is going to be working on that project, all the engineers or SREs or other people that are going to be working on that project, their peers, and everyone who is going to be impacted by it. So like other engineering teams and organizations, potentially the product team, if there is consequences like for the budget, you might need to involve finance as well. If there is legal consequence, you need to involve the legal team as well. And this person can write a PRFAQ. And by the way, in the book, I explain like not necessarily needs to be a press release that you start with. Press release is the best format, but it could also be the email from the CTO to the entire company. Hey, today we are announcing that we are replacing this old project with this new project. This is what's going to happen. This is the benefits for us. This is the problems that we had before. So that also works because what you're doing is painting a vision of the future, right? And when people reading that, it's like, wow, yeah, let's do that. Yeah. Right? I'm aligned. I understand. Let's talk about the strategy now. So now you go to the Q&A section, the FAQ section, and like you have like some hard questions there, like why are we doing? Like what are we saving? Like what is the consequence if we don't do it? Right? What is the cost of delay? You can include all that in the FAQ section. Very technical. In that case, since it's an internal project, you do not need the customer FAQ section. Right? Just the internal FAQ section because your customer is internal, and the same team working on it is the same thing. So like you don't need that section. So in the book, I explain how to use it for that use case as well.
It's so interesting. I'm like, I have so many questions for you, Marcelo. One of the things though that your point about this internal project as well has struck me is, it seems like we could use this technique also to just do any kind of organizational change management, right? Like we're going to try to change like, how we recruit new team members, right? And so we could use this same sort of start with the end in mind type approach of like, here's my press release, the internal email to the whole team about our new approach for recruiting the best talent. And then use the same FAQ approach to really kind of interrogate that strategy.
Yeah, that's a very common use case. Like everything related to HR, recruiting, IT, compliance, all of that could start with a PRFAQ as well to have like these conversations, right? So people can discuss and think through and understand the impact that it might have for them. That's not unusual at all.
Yeah, and I like this is at the beginning of the process. It paints the vision of the future at the beginning of the process, not like at the end of the process often where you're kind of telling some people whatever about what's going to happen after kind of all the work has been done. This is at the beginning. I kind of like that.
How have you seen this like brought into organizations that maybe already have an established culture around decision making? Right? Like it would be easy if the three of us are going to start a new startup together. Like we're malleable and we're like open-minded and we're like, yes, we're going to do this because it's worked for Marcello in the past and we buy in. But what about an organization that's already established and maybe is rigid or calcified in their approach to decision making?
Yeah, it's not easy, Brad. I wish I would say like this is how you do it, and it's going to be easy, and everyone is going to be happy. But you know this, changing organization is really hard. Like change is slow. There's a lot of resistance. Even when people say we do want to change, we think this is going to be great. But there is always pushback, right? And there is always a person that's going to point as soon as the first failure say, "See, I told you this wouldn't work." Right? And the reality is a lot of change require persistence. You need to try like 1, 2, 3 times before you say like it didn't work for us, right? So my recommendation, and it's the same way that I would recommend someone who is adopting a new framework like OKR or other frameworks like that. Like don't start big. Don't start all at once, right? Like pick one project that is manageable, with a few people and do it there and see how it fits the culture, right? And do some adjustments to see how did it work in that setting, right? And even if it was a complete failure, I would say try again in another project and try again in another project, right? Because you don't know if the failure was related to the project or to the framework. And I've been in many meetings where OKR went terribly badly, both from the planning and the results of having OKRs. But like once you persist and you start to learn and how to use it, you start to reap the benefits.
Hey, Brad, I can tell you, inspired by Marcello's book, I kind of just got a little, I lit a spark recently, and I'll tell you how I did it.
Huh?
I didn't, and it got adopted
Yeah, tell
better
me.
than I thought it was going to get adopted. But we'll see. We're still in process, so we still see how well it works out. A couple of weeks ago, we were starting another planning cycle. At kind of the beginning of our planning cycles, people write these documents that sort of pitch their ideas with the ROI and all that kind of stuff, right? And someone suggested, we should really have a common format for this. And just because I had Marcello's book in my mind, I just kind of said offhand, I was like, well, why don't we use this PRFAQ format? Like Amazon uses it, people really like it.
Love it.
And there was kind of a general agreement for that. And then there happened to be one person in the room who had previously worked at Amazon. And she was like, oh, yeah, that's great. And it just kind of took off. So we'll see how it goes. People aren't done with them. Next week, we start reviewing them. But the real point I'm trying to make is at the beginning of sort of a planning cycle when people are pitching ideas, yeah, it's a great time to do it. And the notion that people wanted a common format, somebody else could have been in the room and suggested a different format. I just happened, I guess, to be the first one to open my mouth. And it was only the reason I opened my mouth is because it was just on my mind because I knew we were talking to Marcello. And so that seems to have worked. We'll see how good they come out, but we'll see how it works and see if I'm sure it'll take a few cranks around the wheel to get them dialed in. I wanted to ask about pitfalls. What are mistakes people make? What should we avoid doing here?
Yeah, there are many pitfalls with PRFAQ. One of them I kind of mentioned, which is people think a PRFAQ is a plan, a tactical plan, right? And instead of like only talking about the vision and the strategy, they go into very high level of detail. Like we're going to build this services and we're going to use these APIs and we're going to create this databases and like do this, all this detail. And like this person's going to work on this project and this person's going to work on that other part. Like PRFAQs are not for that. Do not try to stuff at everything into a PRFAQ. You can extend the PRFAQ by having things on the appendix, but I would recommend to keep it very high level, right? Very superficial. What you don't want to do is create a PRFAQ that feels like a perfect plan, regardless if it is perfect or not. And then people are not comfortable providing feedback, right? Because like, oh, so much work has gone into that already. Like I don't have the courage to question this thing here that might make the entire tower collapse, right? So
you made that point about in the book. You make that point about like the build, measure, learn, and putting build in the wrong place. Like if your prototype is too advanced, if your prototype is too robust, it actually reduces the input, the honest feedback you're going to get.
yeah, that's my personal hack when I ask people to provide feedback on blog posts or articles that I'm writing. I always say, here's a draft. Even though I work my ass off to make this draft perfect, I always say, here's a draft. Because when you say like that, people are like, okay, it's a draft. like he's really asking for feedback. So let me give him like what I really think, versus me telling them like, I worked 10 hours on this article. Like, can you give me some feedback? People are going to be very shy about pointing flaws on my view. And strategy is just like that, right? Like if you say like, oh, we have the perfect strategy here, review it for us. Who's going to have the courage to break your heart, and say like, this strategy sucks?
So one pitfall is the don't put too much detail in it. That's a common pitfall.
Well, and another common pitfall here is getting it too polished before you start to circulate it for feedback.
Yes, there is a right timing to do things. Like you wanna create a draft first, so otherwise people don't have anything to hang on to. But like the process of getting the feedback is the process of working the PRFAQ.
Working the PRFAQ, that's a great way of phrasing it.
Yeah. Another pitfall that is somewhat common is for people to write the PRFAQ at the end,
Oh,
like retrospectively. Like you're about to launch a product and it's like, well, let's create a PRFAQ now. So we can be all aligned. Well, we should have been aligned in the beginning of the project, not at the end, right? So that's not the purpose of a PRFAQ. And the PRFAQ is really a confidential document, right? Even though you have a press release that sounds like it's meant to be sent to the press, it's not. It's confidential. It's internal only. So the team can feel confident that they can work on it without worrying that we're ever going to publish this to the press. That's why you haven't seen many PRFAQs out there. Even Amazon doesn't publish many. I think they publish 2 PRFAQs, as far as I know, because there is a lot of confidential information on it. There is financial information, there is legal questions, there is root questions that it's uncomfortable to put out there.
Yeah, that makes sense. You want people to feel like they can talk openly about it.
is that also then a pitfall? Is having people inadvertently assume that it's not a draft or that it will be published? How do you and how do you set the tone for that? Is that just sort of by fiat, like we will treat this as truly a working document, or is there other tips you have on helping people's mindset be framed that way?
Yeah, a PRFAQ is really a tool for the team that is working on the project and the stakeholders related to that project and the decision makers. Usually, you don't want to share outside of that group of people, right? So the lack of context can be problematic. So even in large organizations, you want to make sure that the PRFAQ is not like everyone can read this, because it might create conflict, it might create politics, and other types of problems. Of course, people can request to read the PRFAQ and you have to evaluate. Often what happens is, and I mentioned this a few times in the book as well, you can create slightly different versions of the PRFAQ. So you have your master PRFAQ that your team work on that has all the confidential information. And then you're going to create a version that maybe redacts a few portions so that you can share more broadly within the organization, never outside of the organization, right? Of course, the one case where you break this rule is when you're asking for an expert advice outside of your company, or you're talking to investors about your startup, then it's outside of your organization. I still recommend people to create a redacted version, like remove, things that you think are very confidential or you don't want to get out there, particularly if it has detail about personal information or about customer information. Then you don't want to put it out there, right? Because that would be a break of confidentiality and sometimes even a break of privacy.
Gosh, I can see even just using this for myself, not even for sharing with other people, to just get clear on what I'm trying to do.
Totally. Your own personal goals.
Yeah, it's really hard to write a PRFAQ without clarity. So the interesting thing about writing a PRFAQ, Scott, just like you said, is as you're writing, you start questioning yourself, right? And I was like, wait a second, this doesn't make any sense. This is not coherent. I need a better story here. So like you revisit, refine your idea, for whatever initiative or project you have into a better one. So the process of writing is phenomenal, really.
Yeah, we were just discussing like a little org change today at our company. I mean, like minor, just adjusting 1 or 2 teams. And as we're talking here, I'm thinking, gosh, we should write a PRFAQ for that. why are we doing this?
Totally.
What are the questions people have? I mean, we're having that discussion. We're doing all the discussion, but no one's writing it down, right? And nobody's sort of.
Yeah.
It's more informal,
Yeah.
getting on the same page.
Yeah, and you can think of a PRFAQ on a case like this or other cases as well as the straw man, right? Like you start from a straw man proposal. So you put something on the paper and then people can poke at it and like give their feedback versus like a free form where like, sometimes you go to these brainstorming meetings where it feels very chaotic. Everyone is throwing an idea. No one is collecting. There is no, convergence of thought. So it feels very weird. PRFAQ avoids that.
Now, it fits also with something that I like to do way lower in the process in terms of technical design, which is get people to write their technical designs down. Because I always like to say, fight with the document, don't fight with each other. Like, let's not, because you get in a tug of war when you're talking, but when you're just reviewing a document, it can be much more civil.
Yeah, I love that. I should have used that tech line in my book.
Don't fight with each other, fight with the document.
Actually, let me add something interesting, Scott. PRFAQs don't have the author name
really?
on them.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Yeah, because the idea is to discuss the merit of the project or the initiative, not discuss, the person behind
yeah,
it.
exactly. Yeah, I like that
Whoa,
point.
that's blowing my
I
mind.
actually had
Marcello.
another question for you, Marcel, if you don't mind. You kind of gave us the pitfalls, but I was kind of curious, like, what are the most controversial things in the framework? And I'll admit, like, as this is sort of like CTO's perspective, and so therefore it kind of, there's a piece of being the CTO where you're like representing the engineering team to the business and representing the business back to the engineering team. And there's a few things in there that I was kind of like, oh, I bet some engineers are going to bristle at this. But what do you feel like the most controversial pieces of this framework are?
I don't think there is a controversial aspect of the framework itself, but what I've seen is, part of the PRFAQ is to get experts to critique the PRFAQ in what they know. So when you're in a room full of engineers and you have a PRFAQ in front of them, you want them to critique the feasibility, the technical feasibility of the project versus, for example, like the privacy laws of GDPR,
Okay.
right?
Right.
Because
Their opinion on something they're not an expert on.
yeah, that you're gonna talk with the legal team and the compliance team, right? Or the council or someone else, right? The same way that you don't want the legal team to read your PRFAQ, ignore the legal aspects and start critiquing the UX aspect of the project, like or the use case or the pricing. So that can be contentious because lots of people have opinion about product, right? And they love to talk about that, but like you need to canalize people's energy into their domain expertise so that the PRFAQ becomes the best that it can be.
Another thing I noticed in there, and I thought you kind of called this out as potentially controversial, is the idea that it has like a location and a date on it, like a date, and in particular, like the imagined endpoint press release is released on a date,
Yeah.
June 1st, 2025. What are your thoughts on that not being a hang up for engineers who so often feel the pressure of the date?
I think it's very important to have a date. The same way it's important if you're doing like a piece of hardware to have a price on the PRFAQ. Like you want people to feel uncomfortable. You want them to challenge, like, and say, wait a second, like I can't do that by that date, or I can't do that with that price, or we can't launch that in that city, from a legal team perspective, for example. So you're putting a few stakes in the ground and like let people navigate that and come back to you and say like, what is it actually possible to be done and what actually not possible to be done, right? And then you go and evolve the PRFAQ in that context to add more value to it, right? But I think like having everyone rally about a date helps everyone. Like your marketing team is going to understand, the engineering team is going to understand, the content team is going to know what to do, right? So we are all aligned on that commonality. So we are not like thinking different things.
Totally. Do you think that if you had this tool, like if you could go back in time now that you have this tool, is there a version of, one of your startups or a team that you were the CTO on where you feel like, oh man, I wish I had had this tool then, and how history might have been different had you had this tool?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I know the startup I left, Haya, 2.5 years ago to join Amazon. Now they have adopted PRFAQ. And what's interesting about the PRFAQ is we're really big on OKRs, but OKR always felt like something is missing here. The story behind of this OKR is missing. The narrative, like why are we doing, like what we're trying to achieve, right? Like felt not there. Even though we were pretty good at writing our objectives and key results, you never felt that had like the bigger thing behind it. So I would definitely have adopted PRFAQ had I known how to use it back then, and definitely all the startups that I've done in the past. I can't imagine myself doing a startup or a big project right now that I wouldn't write a PRFAQ. And I did one just 2 weeks ago for a new project that I'm considering starting. I'm not even starting. I'm just like considering. So I wrote a PRFAQ, shared with 3 people, started to get feedback. I'm going to throw that out, write a new one that is better than the previous one because I got a lot of feedback. And that's great, right? So you know where you're going, that makes sense or it doesn't make sense, resonate, doesn't resonate.
Yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of like a kind of painted door strategy as well that kind of overlaps with PRFAQ, right? Where it's like, I don't know, we got this idea. Let's put a let's put a storefront up and see if anybody clicks on it, as a way of kind of learning before building, right? So it
Yeah.
does seem like there's some overlap in that strategy.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about PRFAQ is like, as you write your PRFAQ, as you're writing your frequently asked questions, let's say one of the questions is like, how much this is going to cost to make? And you go like, oh gosh, I need to figure this out, right? So let me do some research on that topic. So one of the questions might be like, how many people are interested on this? And you're like, well, we don't know. So let's go measure. Let's go figure out. You can leave assumptions and you can pull it out. We think there is like 10,000 people a month that need this product, or you can go and measure, right? And so like we know for sure there is like 700 people that search for it on Google every month, right? That's a good start. So it forces you to do this kind of research and go out there and like figure stuff out.
Love it.
So how's the book been received?
Very positively. I'm learning a lot about book marketing. I never done a book before. It's so different. It's so slow. This is it's a whole different industry than what I'm used to with software. It's also not a product that you can update very easily. You can just like push updates to someone that got a hard copy of the book.
That's so interesting. And did you write a PRFAQ before writing the PRFAQ book?
Yes, I did, Brad. I did write a PRFAQ about the PRFAQ book. It was terrible, not good, but it did help me think through certain aspects of this book, right? So my original intention with the book was I'm going to write this book just for startup founders. And then I realized, you know what? The real beneficiaries of this are not startup founders, it's anyone doing any innovation who want to tell an idea, right? And want to think through an idea and want to articulate that idea to other people. And potentially they want to inspire people to join them on this journey, right? So it could be a product manager, it could be a CTO, it could be an executive at a company or the VP of HR that wants to create a new like referral program for interns or whatever they are coming up with, right? So it's anyone that is adding, removing, or making changes to a program, a business, a service, a policy.
Well,
I
that
love
sounds
it. I am.
great.
This is. I loved that I got to read the book, and this conversation has inspired me to think, man, there's so many ways you could use this. Like for to Scott's point about personal goals or just change management. So it's super exciting stuff, Marcel.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for coming on today. We appreciate your time. And if people want to go get the book, where do they go?
they can visit the book website. You can Google for PRFAQ book or go to www.theprfaq.com.
All right. Thanks, Marcello.
Thank you so much for having me, folks.
It was great talking to you again, Marcelo.
Yeah. Take care.
This episode of How Many CTOs Does It Take podcast was edited by Saffron Eftigal. Our theme song was AI generated by Brad. Please follow us on all the social media platforms at How Many CTOs Pod. You can find us on YouTube, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Threads, X, TikTok, and Patreon, or at our website at howmanyctospod.com. And remember to rate, review, and subscribe on the podcast platform of your choice. Thanks for listening.